Uh, so as I was saying, my topic, maybe like few other talks, it's like a more philosophical, big picture topic. So as you can see from the title, Psychology, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing in the 21st Century. So this talk lies at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and spirituality. So one might be wondering what is the place of this kind of talk in a very highly specialized, conference. But some of you might know, in recent times, there has been a lot of interest in spirituality from people working in different fields of psychiatry and psychology. Both the APAs in America, American Psychology Association and Psychiatrists Association, they invited people representing different forms of spirituality to talk about its relevance to mental health. So you can see, this is, even though I know that there are many scientists, psychologists or psychiatrists, especially who come from a very scientific background and they really don't like to hear about spirituality or philosophy. But increasingly, even mainstream psychologists mental health crisis, the global mental health crisis, as in his book, The Anxious Generation. So my approach here is even more capacious than some of these books. And I'm drawing especially on, for the beginning part of this talk, on a psychologist, psychiatrist, and philosopher, Ian McGilchrist, with whom some of you might be familiar, and some of his books.
Yes.
And I'm drawing on his framework of the left and right. In both of his books, talks about the left hemisphere's vision of reality versus the right hemisphere's vision of reality. And this is a framework he uses to really understand the modern condition. So the left brain, also one other kind of note of clarification. So as we know, this is not an exhaustive framework. When he says the left brain has these features and the right brain has these features, he's using this as a methodology because our mind and brain are kind of intertwined when it comes to understanding reality. Anyway, so according to the left hemisphere's vision of reality, the world appears as static, isolated, and fragmentary. It's built like brick on brick, aiming at unassailable conclusions. It can easily be manipulated, controlled, and mechanized. And it also sees the world as decontextualized, abstract, detached, and disembodied. So you might also already be, think.
Yeah.
All right. So I was saying,
Yes.
I'm trying. The first part of my talk focuses on a diagnosis of the modern condition, and I'm using the framework of Ian McGilchrist and his theory of the left and the right brain, how the left brain sees the world and how the right brain sees the world, or the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is very scientific, as I mentioned, decontextualized, abstract, detached, and the right hemisphere is it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It sees the world as complex, dynamic, flowing, and interconnected. It's never static. It's never detached from awareness or disembodied. It's also context dependent. It's holistic. And moreover, it embraces beauty, morality, empathy, and emotional depth as essential to understanding and meaning. So what does this have to do with the way we see the modern world? So the world we now inhabit, um, there are two hemispheres that should ideally cooperate, but they're currently engaged in a kind of power struggle, according to McGilchrist. And this conflict between the left and the right brain explains many aspects of contemporary Western culture. Whereas in the past, this picture was counterbalanced by cultural history, natural world, arts, and religion. But today, because of the kind of power struggle between the left and the right brain, and again, this is a quasi-metaphor. It's not to be taken literally because as we know, when we look at the world, it's not just one part of the brain, it's the entire brain and the billions of neurons and their synapses and their connections and all that. So anyway, because there seems to be a kind of a conflict between these two hemispheres, um, there are kind of, it distorts uh, our ability to look at the world in a more holistic way. So the world increasingly appears as mechanistic, fragmented, decontextualized, marked by unwarranted optimism, paranoia, and a pervasive feeling of loneliness or emptiness. So this is kind of the basic analysis of McGilchrist, with which I agree. However, I kind of I add further evidence to this diagnosis of the modern condition from other fields such as arts, literature. So if and these are some examples. This is, drawing from wide range of fields, because I mean, you need more evidence, more data that this is indeed, we're living in a world where the world appears to us in a very one-sided way. So if you look at, for example, some modern literature, especially some of the most famous writers and artists, such as Robert Musil and his famous book, Man Without Qualities, you can clearly see, something has really gone wrong with the way we are looking at the world. So here's this description that says, quote, what has arisen is a world of qualities without a man, of experiences without someone to experience them. Probably the dissolution of the anthropocentric way of relating. And the picture kind of epitomizes that. And similarly, from a famous French writer and also artist, Antoine Artaud, in his book, in one of his writings, he talks about fragmentation, talks about his own experience in these really frightening terms. So the quote says, this cataclysm which was my body, this dislocated assemblage, this piece of damaged geology, this dislocated assemblage. I mean, this is a vast landscape on the point of breaking up, and it continues, end of quote. So I mean, and the famous painting on my right, it's the Scream by Munch, kind of again shows that the self that appears to us in the modern times is highly fragmented, it's highly disturbed. And then you have another quote that I can show from none other than Nietzsche, when as he is talking about freedom and the free spirit, he is kind of frightened by what is going to come. For example, in this quote from Gay Science, Nietzsche says, quote, conversely, and then such as a freedom of the will, that the spirit would take leave of all faith and every wish for certainty, being practiced in maintaining himself on insubstantial ropes and possibilities and dancing even near abysses. Madly thoughtless fragmentation, fraying of all foundations, and it goes on, end of quote. So this idea of detached, abstract, decontextualized, fragmented reality, it's being shown again and again through different forms of writings, philosophy, literature, art, such as surrealism, expressionism, this background picture. And so what is happening? What is happening is a total loss of unity. On the one hand, there is hyper-subjectivism, a fragmentation from within that effaces all reality and renders the self a mere occasion for the swarming of independent subjective events, sensations, perceptions, memories, and the like. And on the other hand, there's kind of hyper-objectivism through science in the name of whatever scientific analysis that we do and try to explain the world, the coldest and most external of gazes. And then when it comes to the art, as the Latin American writer Ortega says, there's kind of profound lack of compassion and empathy. So he says, quote, a ban on all pathos, given that depicting a realistic world of living beings is no longer a primary goal of modern art. Such works can no longer engage compassionately with the sorrows and joys of normal human existence. And it goes on, end of quote. And you can see the paintings, the famous painting by surrealist Dali, and then Duchamp, famous fountain, which is a urinal, but it's supposed to be the greatest art of the 20th century. I mean, this is really what he calls as the dehumanization of art. So it's happening on multiple fronts, or multiple fields of inquiry is kind of telling us that something is really, really wrong with the modern condition. And so, yeah, and so let me kind of summarize the diagnosis and then maybe provide my, and then way forward. So when it comes to the specific field of psychology, The psychologist scholar Louis Sess talks about schizophrenia traits and the kind of traits that appear in the modern self and their kind of similarities. So this is so interesting and so revealing. So when it comes to schizophrenia, we know there is a kind of feeling of loss of unity, unified self, loss of logical thinking, abstract thinking, loss of emotion, dementia, hypersensitivity. And eventually, all of these things lead to hyperreality, simulacrum, and that French philosopher about Baudrillard talks about. But anyway, so on the one hand, you have these schizophrenia traits, but on the other hand, now look at the modern and postmodern self and its traits. Again, as I was talking earlier, through all of these different pieces of writings, there is a fragmentation that is widely acknowledged, loss of your unified self. There is self-alienation, hypersubjectivity, hyper-reflexivity, hypercritical mentality, dehumanization, and disappearance of the active self. And in fact, it's so interesting. When it comes to even the human body, as psychologists pointed out, the way human body is experienced by schizophrenia patients, like perceiving the body as a machine, such as robots or computers or parts of a machine, is highly significant because that's how body is analyzed in many scientific fields of inquiry. And in fact, the human being itself is sometimes defined as a biological machine. So this is really, really amazing when it comes to a diagnosis of the modern condition. So at bottom, the modern loss of faith, it really does not concern God or transcendence or anything higher. It involves reality itself, and it makes human life radically fleeting. Life has never been as fleeting as it is today. Not just human life, but the world in general is becoming radically fleeting. And there is a widespread disenchantment with modern life, as expressed by so many philosophers, such as Byung-Chul Han in his book, The Burnout Society. Overperformance leading to self-exploitation, hyper-reality, narcissism, and then, of course, I mentioned earlier, like the mental health epidemic leading to depression, loneliness, post-humanism. I mean, I can show you so many graphs of some of these things if evidence is needed, but I guess we are all familiar with some of this. So that's the kind of first part. The modern condition, of course, on the flip side of things, you can talk about the positive gains of modernity. I don't deny that, like the tremendous advancement in medical technology, increasing life expectancy and all that. That's true, but we also have managed to destroy much of the ecosystem, as we all know, the environmental crisis coming through economic growth and all that. So it is a complex situation, but on the psychological front, it seems from all of this evidence, there is something terribly wrong with our modern condition. That's not to say every person is terribly unhappy and all that, but by and large, this picture seems to make sense. So if that is the case, what is the way forward? Obviously, I'm not going to give you guys a kind of magical bullet or something like solution that will once and for all save the world. Obviously, no such thing exists. But I've been thinking about this in my books and writings, it appears, and in my speeches too. I've been promoting what I call, not promoting, I've been arguing for what I call the anthropocosmic self, as opposed to the self that has lost any form of unity, that is characterized by fragmentation, or that is highly subjective, highly individualistic. I'm proposing for a new conception of the self because, among other things, I think our notion of the human being is the most important component of happiness, meaning in life, human flourishing, mental health, and all of these psychological issues. So I'll spend the next 5 to 7 minutes talking about it, and then maybe we have a discussion. So are you guys still with me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, it goes on very well. Thank you.
Dr. Kamal, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you, Mohammed.
So I suppose you can hear me. I can go on.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, all right. So I'm done with the first part, and this is the kind of second part. The anthropocosmic self as a kind of way forward, as a way to overcome fragmentation, and then this way of extreme left brain-focused view of the world and all that. So what is the anthropocosmic self, and what are its basic premises? So this itself is a very complex notion, but it begins with some of these basic premises, such as cosmos, the universe, and the self are not two separate realities, but two sides of the same coin, a coin that reflects a higher metaphysical unity. And I'm talking about an organismic unity, which pervades all forms of existence or reality. And as one Sufi metaphysician, Al-Kunawi, actually from Turkey, if you go to Konya, you will still see beside Maulana, the famous philosopher Sadruddin Kunawi and his grave. So he was a Turkish philosopher, Sufi metaphysician, and so in one of his books, he talks about how everything is connected to everything else. Kullu shay'in fi kullu shay. So that
Recording stopped.
reality of the self is no longer located in the conventional narrow sense of individualism. And you can also talk a great deal about the environmental implications of such a view, interconnecting all beings. But anyway, these are the basic premises. And in my book, analysis of the self from a psychology, phenomenology, philosophy, and sociological perspectives, because you have to start from the bottom. And in this talk, I'll not be able to go through all the kind of basic step-by-step through which I arrived at this notion of the anthropocosmic self. But if you're interested, you can look at my own humble theory of the self, which is a spectrum theory. And in my book, it's a highly complex diagram and having a lot of layers and stuff. But the basic sense of it is easy to understand. It's based on Sufi philosophy. It engages different philosophies, Western and non-Western. It also is very holistic. It involves body, self, or soul, heart, and spirit. They're all kind of interconnected. By spirit, I don't have to mean something like a metaphysical transcendent entity. By spirit, I mean something that every human being has. Think about children. Think
Recording in
about
progress.
how they imitate their parents. So I'm sure you have noticed the being in spirit. Being in good spirit is, we still use that phrase in English. So spirit is something that does not have to be kind of very mysterious, because I know sometimes from a quote unquote scientific perspective, we tend to have a kind of very superficial understanding of these terms. Anyway, this is a more holistic view, and it has all of these implications as we think about happiness, meaning in life, and human flourishing. So what are some of those? Again, I have only a few minutes, unfortunately, the connection and all that. So I'm just rushing, as you can see, and I'm also trying to summarize. So the anthropocosmic self, building on those premises, and if it's difficult to follow, just remember this. It begins with the intuition that we are part of a greater whole, that our reality is not just confined to our own mental, psychological world. There must be something that we are connected to. And this is so easy to prove, because everybody has had experiences where they felt depressed, they felt like they're at the end of the world, and they feel like they need to spend some time in nature, in the park or whatever, beautiful scenario. And then you go out in nature, you suddenly feel an expansion, you feel you are connected with nature, and for at least few minutes, it does not solve your mental health crisis, but it gives you some kind of peace because of the peace of the natural world itself. So how is that possible to explain if there is no connection between
Recording stopped.
and the wider natural world? So so you can see, this is not very difficult to prove when I'm talking about this part of a greater whole. Anyway, so the conclusion of the anthropocosmic self are these features, that our selfhood does not have a kind of fixed, static definition. It reflects everything, all determinate things, through indeterminacy, like a mirror which is completely empty and completely full at one and the same time. I know it's a mouthful, but it's highly subtle. It's a very subtle point. Think about yourself like a mirror. What is a feature that comes to mind when we think about mirror? So a mirror reflects your own image, right? But it can reflect not just your image, it can reflect any image, anything. And think about not just this physical mirror, think about a mental mirror. Again, in your mind, you can have a concept of yourself. You can have a concept of anything else. However, none of those concepts, including your conception of yourself, defines you. because you are always more than that. Just like the mirror, which can absorb, which can reflect any and all images, but at the same time, in itself, it's empty of all those images. It's a perfectly logical argument. If you have questions, we can come back to it. So if our self is like that mirror, then selfhood is defined by a never-ending process of self-discovery and self-finding. It leads to what I call a cosmic consciousness, where you can have an expansion of the self by integrating your family, community, nation, world, cosmos. It's like a concentric circle where you began with your little, with our little family and the little circle of, our friends, and then neighborhood and all that. But then gradually expands, more communities, even nations, even the worlds, and more than the human world, including, non-human world, everything else. But in order to really go there, we also need discipline. We also need to purify ourselves of our self-centered individualism, egoism, nepotism, ethnocentrism, and all of that. So if all of that is possible, and it does seem like a possible scenario, then the meaning of life question, human flourishing, becomes completely different. Although it will not solve each and every individual mental health problem, and that is not the purpose of this talk, but it will at least be able to address the big picture, the modern condition itself, which is diagnosed with fragmentation, loss of unity, machine-like reality, which is all kind of not true. It's a false imposition on the world. Anyway, if you are following my idea of the anthropocosmic self, and if you feel this is making sense, then this is how I would redefine meaningful life. Not in terms of wealth, not in terms of popularity and success and all of that, which can be, which is possible for some people, but by and large, my picture involves these three fundamental components, and again, very easy to follow. First, material goods. A healthy, meaningful, flourishing life should have a baseline of material goods, like basic health, education, housing. We can all agree on that. But beyond that, we also need social goods, like family, friends, relationship, meaningful work. So psychology, modern psychology, most of the time, are a lot of philosophers, they stop at these two components. They think that, especially there's a lot of focus on relationship, which is true. It's one of the most important components of happiness. There have been so many studies about that. And of course, you need some certain level of income and wealth. People say in the US, you need at least 80,000 to 100,000 bucks, dollars, to have some kind of basic happy life. Because beyond that, even if you have more wealth, you have a kind of more diminishing return. You don't get to be happier, even if you earn more money beyond a certain amount. However, what is neglected in all of this is the spiritual component. The spiritual component, which has the elements of prayer, self-knowledge, spiritual discipline, inwardness, and a connection with the greater whole. So, but if you believe that happiness should take this holistic approach, combining material goods, social goods, and spiritual goods, then the definition of happiness, meaning in life, and flourishing becomes different. Happiness is not confined to just a feeling. It becomes a permanent state of mind, characterized by contentment and self-knowledge. So with that, let me conclude. So I spoke about the modern condition. I spoke about how there is because especially on the focus on the left brain, focus on our analytic ability, quote unquote, scientific abilities, computational ways of defining intelligence, resulted in lots of other complicated social political factors. Of course, I'm summarizing, but I've written a lot about all of this. Resulted in a world which is fragmented, devoid of unity and all that. Now, I'm proposing the anthropocosmic self as a way forward to redefine the human being, to redefine the self, which lies at the center of psychology and human flourishing. So in this picture, being human is not a given, it's an achievement. It's always a work in progress. It's described with the phrase, the art of living. So, but modern life makes it only harder to attain the true meaning of being human because of constant focus on success, performance and all that. But if you embrace the anthropocosmic self, then you should be able to address a lot of the things that we are suffering from, like, issues related to identity politics or identity in general. Because the anthropocosmic self, I talked about cosmic consciousness. It's able to embrace even contradictions within one's identity. This is a very subtle point. Again, I don't have time to elaborate, but I kind of hinted at this. Being able to live as a multidimensional self, being able to overcome accidentalities of life, and being able to embrace diversity and realize cosmic consciousness. So overall, the question of self-identity becomes centered on something greater than the individual self. It also overcomes those limited notions of the self where we tend to define ourselves by success machine, or we should be just earning money and success and all of that. And again, you see the flip side. If you define yourself as a success machine only, which is very common these days among students, you see the consequences. You may be very intelligent, you may be succeeding all the time, but you're also suffering from a lot of anxiety because you feel like you always have to succeed. So as opposed to that picture, if you focus on the anthropocosmic self, there's a long-term gains that we can all gain from self-exploration and self-discovery. All right, thank you so much.